All righty, I'm Carolyn. I'm an alcoholic.
Carolyn.
I'm going to set a timer for myself. It's always a strange thing when someone says, "Do you want to come and speak for 30 minutes?" I think, no. My sobriety date is 10/8/15, so I just celebrated 9 years. And thank you. My sponsor is Shannon D, and she's been my sponsor for several years. I had been sponsored by a couple of other gals. My journey in AA this time started in the penitentiary, and prison had been the prayer. I had been in an ICU unit up at Harborview, and I had gone in there and they put me in a medically induced coma, and it was a direct result of my alcoholism and drug addiction. And they had to do a series of things, and it was an extremely large production, and they asked me to stay, and I did. And I was pretty combative about being one of those people that had to be in the hospital. Like they kind of had to bribe me to stay. I was one of those. They didn't bribe me, but they had to have known the tomfoolery I was up to while I was laying in that hospital bed, because it was just short of being a drug den, and they didn't say a word. I had unsavory people coming in. Was actively using in the hospital. And one of the things, I've gotten myself tightened and backed into corners lots of times. And but this time, I come out of this deal, and I was in the hospital 6-8 weeks that time. But I'd come out of this coma, and my significant other was there, and he had gotten sober. He was sober at the time, and we had separated, but he was still somebody who just checked on me all the time. He's like, "I can't be by you, honey, but I'll stand by you." And he had showed up to the hospital, and he was talking to me, and he was like, "Well, it was a close one this time. It's always a close one." And I said so. I was like, "Yeah, the doc said that that you almost died, sugar." And I was like, "Oh, that's what they always say." And he's like, "True." He goes, and I've always kind of respected the way you just do you. You're pretty unapologetic about your alcoholism. You live your life the way that you want to." And he said, "Carolyn, I just want to tell you, when I called, I asked how you were doing. And they said, well, she's not getting any worse, but we don't anticipate her getting any better." And I don't know why that struck me like an arrow into my heart. It did. And I'm a person, I didn't get sober for the kids. I didn't get sober for my boss, or because my grandmother was sad, or prison. You could never threaten or shame me into right action. I was not that girl. But when he said that to me, what I got awash with was just the really kind of flamboyant way that I played with my life. And that maybe I was closer to death than I was living. And I'm not going to tell you I even had a real trouble with that, but I heard him, and I said this prayer. And at that time, I was looking at a lot of time in prison. I had sold a bunch of narcotics to the police and took them on a high-speed chase. I was driving a Toyota. I'm not sure why I thought I was going to get away. It's not even a question to think I'm going to get away. I just can't stop. Because if I pull over, then that means I'm going. And they're going to take away the booze and the dope, and then I got to meet me, and I'm just never going to just sign up for that willingly. And that I had, gotten out, I'd bailed out of jail, and I went on the run, and I was on the run for 2 years. And I had bounty hunters kicking in doors looking for me, and I had abscesses on my body so bad that when they caught me one time and took me to the jail said, "Absolutely not. We won't take her to a hospital." And there was some part of my thinking, it was like there was this grief. It's like, God, I can't go to jail to save my life. And this other part that was like, keep the wounds, because then maybe they won't catch you. If they catch you, they can't keep you. It was like, I think about those things at just kind of the level of insanity. But anyways, sitting in the hospital. My friend tells me this thing, and so my prayer is like, God, if you can just keep me alive long enough to get me to prison, like I'm done. And that was October. I walked into the door of prison October 8th of 2015, and I haven't had a drink since. But it's not my first trip with this. I was a person, I got sober the first time when I was 25. And I'd gotten sober because I had some legal consequences and some state involvement with my kids. And I got sober to avoid consequences. I am a person, I think about when I was young. I just had this wild imagination when I was little. I had imaginary friends. I insisted that my mother make them food. um, you couldn't have told me that they weren't there. And I loved living in pretend. I loved living in pretend. The nature of what was going on in my household was unstable in the best of times, dangerous in the worst of times. And pretending created some safety. I don't know when pretending turned into lying, but at some point it did. Um, my very first drug of choice was sugar and lye. I would grab the bowl full of sugar cubes and go into the closet and shove them into my mouth as quickly as I could. Um, and I would come out and I would have that like rush of having done something that I wasn't supposed to do and this terror that I might get caught. And I stayed addicted to that feeling for 40 years. Anything that I came in contact with, like that rush would hit my body, and that fear of being caught. And if I did, it didn't matter if the truth sounded better, the lie would come out. And now the kids call it gaslighting. It has a name. I don't know if it had a name back then. But I mean, I would look people in the face and tell them a lie. And so, it was like, and all of that stuff, it was like this, I moved farther and farther and farther away from myself. And I remember I woke up one day and I just didn't have a clue. I'd gotten sober the first time when I was 25, when I had these consequences and these kids, life in trouble, and the judge shaking his finger at me. And in early sobriety, I navigated some really challenging stuff. My kids were in CPS and they were on their way home. I was in that process, and one of my children died there, and I wouldn't tell you that I had a single solitary tool at that point. I was 6 months sober, 3 months out of treatment. I'd never been sober in my life, and I was coming to meetings to get my slip signed because the judge said I had to. And every time I put my slip in the basket, I was deeply embarrassed. It sounded like people were here of their own volition, and I wasn't interested in being here of my own volition, but I sure didn't want to be sent here. But I had this spiritual experience, around the death of this boy. And what had happened is, one of the first gifts is that I didn't have the ability to show up with the dishonesty or bravado that I would have had that boy not died. The only way that I could show up was with the way that I felt. And I had, and I was deeply embarrassed at the time, is that I had more grief about the way that boy lived than the way that he died. And that I was never, it was the guilt of who I'd been as his mom, and that there was no way to make that right. And so I had this, guy come up. He called me on the phone, and he had been put in contact with me through someone else. And he said, "Hi, my name is Ted, and I'm an addict. And I got your number from such and such." He goes, "But I don't, I don't want to come off weird, but I'm also an attorney." And he said to me, he goes, I'm not ambulance chasing. You are, I really just wanted to call you and tell you how deeply sorry I am. And I wanted to ask you a couple of things. He said, do you know that you're entitled to legal representation? And do you know that this isn't your fault? And I just shattered. I'm a girl that goes to court and I say guilty and I wait for him to give me a cheese sandwich. I'm always guilty. Um, and it didn't occur to me that anybody should come to my rescue and try to help me with this thing, because in my mind, that boy was dead because of me. And he said, I'm going to help you. And so he did, and it was just the strangest thing, like these levels of advocacy that came as a result of being in the rooms. I had people show up at this funeral home. I walked outside and they were all just standing there, and they took me to lunch. This attorney, he says, I'm going to take you, and one of the things we're going to do is going to be one of the hardest things you've ever done. They're going to ask you questions, and you're going to say yes if it's true, and you're going to say no if it's not. And if anything they say is inappropriate, I'm going to defend you, and you don't say a word. And it was the very first time that I had the level of like consideration and advocacy and direction and care. And I didn't have a thing to offer anyone as far as I could tell. And they showed up and they did it joyfully. And I remember thinking to myself, along the way, I don't know how you get to be a person that cares about people in the way that you guys do, but I want to. And, and it was the first thing that inspired me to do the work. I stayed sober for a number of years, about 6.5, long enough to have that boy, bury the boy. And the thing with the lawsuit was that, walking through that thing took about 5 years. And when it was all said and done, like the laws around the way that psychotropic drugs were prescribed to kids in state care changed. So like from that day to this day, no other child has ever died in Washington state the way that my son died. I didn't know that I was walking into movements or accessing power or making change for the world. First I said yes because I didn't have anyone. And then I made a decision to like fight this battle because somebody needed to be held accountable, and I was angry. And then when it was all said and done, years later, all I wanted was for no other parent to have to walk through this thing the way that I had to walk through that thing. And it was a really strange thing. My son died in 1995, and I had a woman reach out to me about a year ago, and she was an educator at the collegiate level. And what she taught it's something in the nature of law, but specifically around social work and healthcare and malpractice. And she reached out to me and she was like, I was so shocked. I don't even know I didn't know how she got in touch with me, but she's like, I'm not trying to disrupt your peace. And if in any way that this is disruptive to you, please disregard the message. But I want to tell you that the death of your son has changed many people's lives. And I want to tell you how. And so she proceeded to tell me about like the education components, that the lawsuit around my son's death, some things around the doctor who was held liable, some experiences that happened in her own like history. And it was so profound. And it was one of those things, almost 30 years had passed since that boy died. And like the walk that I had done, like that I stayed sober and did that walk, like was still producing impacts for the greater good in the world. One of my prayers was when that boy died was, God, I can't imagine that you hate me so deeply that this is retribution for my failings as a parent. And for whatever reason, I believe that. I think that those kinds of circumstances, they either take you closer to God or they take you farther away. For whatever reason, as a person who was really brittle with God when she got here, like it took me closer. And it was like, if you can just make it really obvious what I need to do every single day, I'll do the next right thing. I got on the bus one time and I wanted to get loaded. I was on my way to get loaded. I was still peeing in a cup, and the kid, my daughter wasn't home. The boy was gone. And I was like vibrating. I was shaking so bad because I wanted to be loaded. And I got on this bus, and I'm a girl that sits in the back, but for whatever reason, I sat in the front. And this guy from the rooms, he's died now, but his name was Jerome, and he was a bus driver. And I sat on the front of the bus, and he could spot me. And I don't remember what question he asked me, something like, "Are you a friend of Bill?" or something. And I was surprised. I'd never ran into somebody randomly, a stranger in the wild, who did this thing. You know what I mean? And I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "Why don't you just stay right here and tell me what's going on with you?" And so I did. And I did that loop. I did the whole bus rotation a couple of times. And by the time I was done, I got off. And like, for whatever reason, those things would print. I got off that bus and I was like, thanks. Like, God took care of me like that. And I would see him in stop signs and billboards, the front page of the newspaper, coming out of the grocery clerk's mouth. It would just come in all kinds of things. I could just see God everywhere. And I just remembered the bargain. And people say, it's like we do our best to not pray for our own selfish ends, that we can in fact pray for self if someone else will be helped by it. And I'm going to tell you that if I stay sober long enough, like those prayers for myself, someone else is helped by it. It's like I'm not running around praying for win the lotto. It's really a strange thing. I had a thought recently. I was like, what would I do if I won the lotto? And my next thought was like, oh, I don't know if I want that. I prayed to get hit by cars so that I get the insurance money. Like, ooh, let this car hit me. Like lotto. And like none of that stuff. Like, I don't feel like I would be a better version of myself if I had the lotto. I actually like my occupation. I like the time that I have. I like the work that I put into it, the effort to be in community. I like that I work with the resources that I have, and that I understand a sense of discipline, and that I'm a steward of the things that are in my care. And it's easy to give when I have abundance, but it is different to share my resource when I don't. But it impacts me differently. And it was like, I think about the things that I would lose. And so, moving back into the death of my son, and one of the other gifts that I got was the ability to learn how to feel a feeling, to the beginning of the feeling, to the end of the feeling. I was a person that sought to magnetize anything that felt good, like magnify it, make it bigger, bring me more of it. And then anything else, just annihilate it. So I'd never learned how to feel any feeling from the beginning to the end. I was a pretender and a fantasizer and an imaginer. And so anytime I felt something, like the very first thing I sought to do was make it be something different than it was. And so, coming in here and doing some work, I was able to align with not only the ability to follow a direction, but a design in which I operate my life that changes the way that I see the world. I thought that miracles were like when people lifted cars off of babies, or a man on the moon or something. I didn't understand that the extraordinary lived in ordinary things, and they were everyday things. This time when I walked into prison, because I was a chronic relapser, I got loaded after I had about 6.5 years sober, and it took me 15 to come back. I came in and out, in and out, in and out. Couldn't stay. But, I walked into the prison, and from that day to this day, that prayer that I said to God, if you can keep me alive long enough to get me into prison, like, I'm done. I'll go where you send me. I'll do what is asked of me. Like, I have not forgotten that prayer. It is as acute today in this moment as it was when I said it, even though I didn't stop using it. But I walked into prison, and there was a woman there, and she She had been there for about 13 years, I think, at the time, maybe 12. She was an accessory to a kidnapping and a murder, and she was one of the most powerful demonstrations and reflections of Alcoholics Anonymous that I'd ever met. Um, Her story was is that there wasn't anybody to take her through the steps, and so she took herself. Is that's how she started in prison, and she didn't get sober right away, but she did, and then outside meetings came in, and she was able to get someone to do the work with her. But that woman taught me about love and service and connection and surrender and God, like more at that time, more than any combination of people had taught me. That woman did, and she started me on the path to doing the work, and I was disgruntled that I was going to have to do it here. I was just like, I tried and it didn't work, and I don't know what else to do. And so, one of the other prayers that came up is that, like, if I could have anything back, because I had destroyed my relationships with my children. My son and I didn't speak, and he wasn't interested in speaking to me. My daughter, while has always remained an ardent champion, she doesn't expect me to stay. And so she doesn't go out of her way to come find me. And, and I was thinking, if I can have anything in the world back, what would it be? It's like home, cars, money, love, family, relationship with the kids, forgiveness. And like in the still, quiet voice, it was like, I would like the ability to authentically show up as myself without trying so hard and not have to apologize for it. And so, the pursuit was, could and would if you were sought. So that I began to seek God in all things. It was last house on the block kind of stuff. I have been in here often enough. Like a superb dream builder. Like I'm excellent. Exterior stuff, I can build a life like that. Magic. But I can't keep that thing. And when material well-being has preceded spiritual well-being, I have drank over and over and over again. And one of the things that I was gifted is that elevate your spirit life, Carolyn, and your physical life will rise to meet it. And so I began to pursue the things of the spirit. And there was lots of, humblings in that. But, I had to get over the sting of the way that I felt, like driving a car that had a dented front fender. Like, it's not that big of a deal. It's nothing. But I mean, like, I felt some type of way because all of a sudden I had this perception of the way that you perceived me. And I had to learn to sit in those kinds of feelings over and over and over again without changing or altering the feeling. And I would remember is that, like, I bought the car and it sat in my driveway until I could get the license, because I have 2 DUIs, 2 high-speed chases, one that made breaking news. It's a miracle that they gave it back to me at all. But I would walk by that car every day and go get on the bus, because I said that I wouldn't get in the car until I had a license and insurance to drive it. It didn't matter that I'd been driving for 40 years, is that I was going to learn how to follow the rule because the rule existed. And like I began to treat my entire life that way. I did it when people were looking, and I did it when they weren't. And, powerlessness and unmanageability has shown up in a myriad of ways. But like the moment I quit drinking, I no longer have a drinking problem. That's, you heard it said around forever. It's like I have a problem with life. And Riley, you just did such a lovely job talking about relationship with God. I didn't know that I was going to come in here and fall in love with that power. But I have. And to be like caught up in the current, it's not rocket science. Is that I have aligned myself in such a way is that if it creates resistance, then I leave it alone. And if it's in flow, then I go. Like I don't have to do anything more than that. And this idea is that, like, you would have told me that any of the myriad of things, the death of a boy or a trip to prison or, any of the number of things, the ICU units, the abandonment of family, um, the near-death experiences, um, the CPS, the attorneys, the lawsuits. Like, you wouldn't tell me any of that would have had any value. James Allen says this. He says, let God be as creative with other people as he's been with you. It's like every single one of those things has turned into like one of the most monumental, functional, um, progressive miracles that I've ever encountered. Moving through, this powerlessness and unmanageability and the absence of sanity. My very favorite definition of sanity is to be free of defect, damage, or distortion. Like, so that I can be right sized, not dual minded. Um, you know, my first level of willingness came with you. It came with that one. This time it came with that woman in prison. Um, and she took me on a path. And she says, we're going to go follow God. And instead of like letting all of the resistances that has always come up about my relationship with God, I said, okay. And I just went. And I didn't worry about how I looked. I've said it before. Like, one of my primary things about following God is that I did not want to end up at the airport banging a tambourine. I just didn't. Um, have you heard the good news? And it has been so much more than that. Inventory has been one of those things that has allowed me to see it's the great bait and switch, is that I think that I'm right and why I'm mad at you. And instead what I find out is how I act when I'm afraid. And I have conduct that has me stepping on the toes of my fellows, seemingly without provocation. And I find invariably I have done or said something that has set a ball in motion. I've never arrived anywhere where I didn't walk. Fifth step. One of my favorite things about fifth step, I heard someone else share this in a meeting recently. At first, it was just that thing of being seen. And this just really being seen. And I can tell you about, robbing somebody's grandma at a cash machine, but I sure can't tell you about how petty I am. It's like these things. I can tell you about the horror. I can't tell you about like my interior and being able to do that. But I'm having a different experience right now. And I heard this shared just so eloquently in a meeting. But my favorite thing about Fifth Step today is listening to one. Is that the work that happened in me, I get to bear witness to it and then experience again when it happens in someone else. And it keeps me like in the continuity of the work that we do here. Defects of character being connected to my natural instincts. That was probably one of the things that brought me the most relief, because I kept thinking that there was something deeply and fundamentally wrong with me. And it turns out that everything was okay. Is that my instincts have worked exactly as they've been designed to protect me. And, but I have conduct when I'm afraid that sends my instincts awry. And like being able to get rid of like that stuff that's happening on my interior allows me to be able to show up in connection with, like in my intimate sexual affairs or in my companionship or my place amongst my fellows in society in a way that lends to or leads actually with generosity, as opposed to like looking to see what I can get. And then it allows me to come to God with something other than a 911 call. Is that like I can be grateful for the trials that are happening in my life, because I understand that like my sensitivity to it isn't because I'm being punished. It is an undeveloped muscle, and I'm getting an opportunity to work out a little bit. And as I gain strength in that thing, then the third step promise comes true, and it's able to bear witness to somebody else that I can help with the thing. Is that like, how would I help somebody with the thing if I didn't walk through the thing? And so, 10th step keeps me really current. Amends has been key. And amends has been more than like, I'm sorry. It is this thing about changing or altering a thing. And so when I change it with the person that I'm amending it with, I also have this like kind of universal understanding that I am going to change it in all of my affairs in a 12-step way. Like, I practice this principle in all of my affairs, not just with you, and I can turn around and be gossipy over here, whatever the thing is. Um, and it clears out my interior enough so that, like, the 11th step practice of prayer and meditation is, in fact, conscious contact with God. And that I am seeking to be directed and guided in my affairs, like in traffic and in the grocery store and with my fussy sister and with the cat who gets on my last goddamn nerves at 5 o'clock in the morning. Like, it's all of it. And so, in closing, all of the things that are in the book are suggestions. I heard this recently too. It's so funny. They go, it's suggested. And then, like, the caveat is that they're over and over again. It says, if you don't do it, you'll die. I mean, I've come pretty close to physical death, and that hasn't been much of a deterrent. But one of the things that has happened is this, that I came alive. Like, I woke up, and if I don't do the things, I'll go to sleep again. And I don't want it. I get to sit here with my son, who will celebrate 5 years in January. And it was one of the great gifts of my life. My sobriety has impacted his sobriety and his mind. So that's all I got. Thanks.
Thanks, Carolyn.